She bought a dress on a Thursday evening. She was supposed to meet her husband for a drink afterward. She never arrived, and the phone call that came the next morning, the one that was supposed to explain everything, would later become the most chilling detail in the entire case. This is the story of Shirley Banks, and nothing about it is ordinary. You're watching Old Casebook. Shirley Banks was 29 years old in October of 1987. She lived in Bristol, England, a city she knew well, a city she had no reason to fear. Born Shirley Reynolds, she was the eldest of three sisters in a family originally from Edinburgh that had relocated to the West Country when the children were young. After finishing school, she studied business management at Bristol Polytechnic, then built a quiet and steady working life in the textile industry. By 1987, she was employed at Alexandra Workwear in Bristol. Reliable, settled, known. She drove an orange Mini Clubman. She had a routine. She had a life. Shirley had met Richard Banks in 1980. Over the years, they moved in together, bought a home, and in 1987 they married. People who knew them described the marriage as happy, not perfect, as no marriage ever truly is, but stable. There was no sign that Shirley was unhappy, no farewell, no preparation for disappearing, just a normal morning on October 8th, 1987. A cup of tea, a goodbye, and Shirley heading out for the day. After work, Shirley had simple plans. She was going shopping and would meet Richard afterward for a drink. At some point that evening, she walked into Debenhams department store in Bristol city centre. A colleague spotted her there shortly before 7:30 p.m. They spoke briefly. Shirley showed her a dress she was thinking of buying. A few minutes later, the purchase was made. That receipt, that small, ordinary piece of paper, would become one of the last confirmed traces of Shirley Banks alive. She stepped out of Debenhams and into a night that no one who loved her would ever fully understand. She never arrived to meet Richard. At first, he reached for the explanations that feel safer. Maybe they had missed each other. Maybe she was with friends. Maybe she had stopped somewhere unexpected. He checked local pubs. He spoke to people they knew. He came home and waited. Hours passed. The door never opened. By morning, the silence had become impossible to ignore. Richard contacted Shirley's workplace, and what he heard stopped everything. Someone at Alexandra Workwear told him that Shirley had already called in sick. The message was that she had been up through the night with an upset stomach and would not be coming in. For a brief moment, that call seemed to offer relief. If Shirley had contacted work herself, perhaps she was alive. Perhaps she had left on her own terms. Perhaps there was a private reason Richard didn't yet know. But that phone call was not what it seemed. Prosecutors would later argue that Shirley made that call while already under the control of John Cannon, a man she had never planned to meet, a man whose name would eventually change everything about this case. As the hours stretched into days, the hope of a simple explanation began to collapse. Richard reached out to everyone he could think of. Hospitals were checked. Friends were called. Nobody had seen her. Nobody had heard from her. Eventually, Shirley Banks was formally reported missing, and what followed became one of the largest searches Avon and Somerset police had ever undertaken. More than 150 officers were involved. The inquiry would later require over 140,000 hours of work. Divers searched Bristol docks and a pond in Lee Woods. Aerial thermal imaging was used. Every lead was followed, and still nothing. As in almost every case involving a missing married woman, Richard was looked at early. Police examined the marriage, the home life, the relationship. They found nothing. Richard was ruled out, and that left investigators facing a far more frightening possibility, that Shirley had encountered someone completely outside her world, a stranger, someone with no connection to the people who loved her. Then something emerged that changed the direction of the investigation entirely. The night before Shirley disappeared, just one night before, another woman in Bristol had narrowly escaped an attempted kidnapping. Her name was Julia Holman. A man had tried to abduct her at gunpoint near a car park in the Cannons Marsh area of the city. One night, an attempted abduction. The very next night, Shirley vanishes. At first, investigators treated this as a possible connection. They were about to discover it was far more than that. On October 29th, 1987, weeks after Shirley disappeared, a man named John David Guys Cannon was arrested in Leamington Spa, not for Shirley's disappearance, for something else entirely. He had walked into a boutique, threatened two women with a knife, and fled after one of them screamed for help. Witnesses gave chase. Police responded when officers stopped Cannon nearby. He had a bleeding hand. What started as a routine robbery investigation was about to become something much larger. Officers searched Cannon's black BMW. Inside, they found handcuffs, an imitation firearm, a tax disc from another vehicle. That vehicle belonged to Shirley Banks. The investigation changed in an instant. Police searched a lock-up garage linked to Cannon, and there, hidden inside, Shirley's orange Mini Clubman. Except it was no longer orange. It had been repainted blue and fitted with false number plates. The registration read SLB386S. Over the years, people have speculated whether those letters were a deliberate reference to Susie Lampler, the London estate agent who vanished in 1986, a case in which Cannon would later be named as the prime suspect. That interpretation was never proven, but the car itself was real. Shirley's car, hidden, altered, in a space belonging to John Cannon. Cannon denied ever knowing Shirley. He claimed he had bought the car cheaply from a stranger outside a car auction. Investigators could not verify that story. And then the forensic evidence arrived. Police had built a set of Shirley's fingerprints from places she was known to have been: her home, her workplace, her parents' house. One of her thumbprints was found on a document inside Cannon's flat. A man who claimed he had never met her, and yet her fingerprint was in his home. The prosecution argued that Cannon had abducted Shirley after she left Debenhams, that he had held her overnight, that the sick call to her workplace the next morning, the call that had briefly seemed like relief, had been made under his control, possibly with a promise that she would be released afterward. That phone call was not a sign that Shirley was safe. It was a sign that she was captive. For months, Shirley's family lived inside that unbearable space, knowing the evidence pointed to Cannon, but not knowing where Shirley was. Cannon was in custody. The case was building, but Shirley had not been found. In cases like this, hope becomes complicated. Families know what is most likely true, and yet, as long as there is no answer, a small and painful possibility remains. That possibility ended on Easter Sunday, April 3rd, 1988. A woman gathering moss in the Quantock Hills in Somerset made a discovery near a stream in a remote wooded area known grimly as Dead Woman's Ditch. It was Shirley Banks. She had been beaten about the head repeatedly with a heavy object, possibly a rock. After nearly 6 months, her family finally knew where she was, but the answer brought no comfort. It brought only the weight of knowing and the silence that follows when hope finally ends. In April 1989, John Cannon stood trial at Exeter Crown Court. The case against him was not built on a single piece of evidence. It was a chain, and every link held. Shirley's car hidden in his garage, her tax disc found in his BMW false number plates, her fingerprint inside his flat, the attempted abduction of Julia Holman the night before Shirley vanished, a pattern of violent behavior stretching across multiple cases, including the rape of a woman in Reading and other abductions and attempted abductions. Cannon was convicted. He received life sentences. The judge made his position clear. John Cannon should never be allowed outside prison again. For Shirley's family, the conviction answered the legal question, but it could not undo what had happened. Her mother, Liz Reynolds, later spoke about the support they received from the community during those unbearable months. Her father, George, spoke about the strain, the media, the public attention, the constant presence of a tragedy that belonged to them but felt owned by everyone. And Richard, the man who had made tea for Shirley that Thursday morning, who had waited for her to walk through the door, who had searched pub after pub, hoping for an ordinary explanation. Richard had lived through something no person should ever have to survive. The danger had not come from somewhere distant or dramatic. It had come from inside the normal spaces of their city, from an ordinary evening, from a shopping trip. But the name John Cannon did not disappear after Shirley's case was closed. He was later publicly named by police as the prime suspect in the disappearance of Susie Lampler, the London estate agent who vanished in July 1986 after leaving her office to meet a client known only as Mr. Kipper. Her body has never been found. The Crown Prosecution Service decided there was insufficient evidence to charge Cannon. He denied any involvement. He was also suspected in the murder of Sandra Court, but again, never convicted. That distinction matters. Suspicion is not the same as proof, but the pattern of allegations surrounding John Cannon kept public attention alive long after Shirley's case was resolved, because behind one solved murder stood a man suspected of far more, and most of those questions would never reach a courtroom. John Cannon remained in prison for decades. He died in custody in November 2024. He was 70 years old. With his death, any remaining possibility of a confession died with him. For the families connected to the wider suspected cases, Susie Lampler's family, Sandra Court's family, that silence was another wound, another door closed permanently, another truth buried. In Shirley Banks' case, the known facts are clear. She disappeared on October 8, 1987. Her body was found on April 3, 1988. John Cannon was convicted of her murder in 1989, but around those facts sit questions that still unsettle. Was Shirley chosen at random, simply the woman who happened to leave the shop at the wrong moment? Did the attempted abduction of Julia Holman the night before mean Cannon was actively hunting? Did those false number plates mean something? Or were they simply another calculated move to confuse police? And how many other women crossed his path without ever realizing the danger they were in? For a true crime audience, the temptation is always to focus on the killer. Killers create the mystery, but Shirley Banks was not a mystery. She was a daughter, a sister, a wife, a colleague. She had studied, worked, built a home, and was just beginning her married life. On the night she vanished, she was not doing anything reckless. She was not in the wrong place at the wrong time through any fault of her own. She was simply living the way all of us live, without knowing that an ordinary evening could become the last one. She bought a dress, she planned to meet her husband, and by the time anyone understood what had happened, Shirley was already beyond reach. The mystery of Shirley Banks is not whether her killer was found. He was. The deeper unease comes from what her case revealed, that behind one solved murder stood a man suspected of far more, and that even the most ordinary evening can become the moment a life is stolen, without warning, without reason, without any sign at all. Thank you for watching Old Casebook. If this case stayed with you, leave a comment below. Subscribe for a new case every week. And remember, every name in these stories belonged to a real person. Shirley Banks deserves to be more than a case number. She deserves to be remembered.